I want to thank Bill Schlinger for inviting me to participate in this symposium. When you see my virtual talk on DVD, I will be en route to Europe to speak in the Netherlands, so I'm not at ISTSS. I seem to be the token critic of the NVVRS on this symposium. It's not that there are a shortage of critics of the NVVRS, of course, but most of them tend to be military historians of military psychiatry, most of whom are unlikely to pay their way to Los Angeles to attend ISTSS to chat at the symposium. But anyway, Bruce Dohrenwend and I, our connections to the NVVRS go way back. Bruce is one of the consultants on the project who helped design it, and one of his suggestions was to have a clinical re-interview sample, and I happen to be one of the clinician interviewers in the study, mainly for the city of Chicago. In any event, the NVVRS has caught the attention of these historians of military psychiatry, largely because of the prevalence rates, which they suspect were artifactually too high. There was something funny here. The NVVRS reported that 30.9% of all men who served in any capacity developed full-blown PTSD. And if you factor in those who fell just short of diagnostic criteria, partial PTSD, you find out that over half of everyone who served developed the disease. Now, in terms of current PTSD, that is the late 1980s when the study was done, 15.2% still had PTSD. Why is this puzzling? Well, here's why. As Dan and Linda King pointed out in their Psych Bulletin article of 1991, quote, approximately 2.8 million served in Southeast Asia. At the peak of American involvement in 1968, roughly 1 in 8 of these were assigned to combat units. That is, only 12.5% were actually in the combat units, actually doing the direct fighting. Most other scholars actually put the figure a little bit higher, about 15%. But in any event, that's a surprising number of PTSD cases when those involved in combat are a relatively small proportion of all those who served. But there's two facts to keep in mind when considering these prevalence rates. First, being exposed to trauma, of course, is not equivalent to PTSD, as all of you know. Most trauma-exposed individuals do not develop the disorder. So although even people who are in combat support and service support may also have occasionally come into harm's way, just being exposed to stressful events doesn't automatically convert into a case of PTSD. Second, as the dose-response effect shows, which was reconfirmed by Bruce in his reanalysis, by the way, those exposed to the greatest danger are those most at risk for developing PTSD. Thus, infantrymen will be at greater risk than, say, supply clerks at an airbase who might occasionally come under mortar fire. Okay, what did Bruce do? Before accepting a case as PTSD positive in the study, he did three things. First, he eliminated cases whose symptoms were not attributable to Criterion A events occurring during the war itself. Second, he consulted the DD-201 personnel files to corroborate self-reported exposure to traumatic events. Most of his corroborating indicators were in fact extractable from the DD-201 files, which actually provide a pretty good source of corroborating information. But it's not perfect. No source of data is perfect. And when the DD-201 was ambiguous, then he consulted further archival sources, including newspaper reports. He was able to corroborate most of the cases of trauma exposure. Incidentally, Chris Free recently published a paper in 2005, British Journal of Psychiatry, in which he attempted to corroborate the self-reported traumatic events of 100 guys who had just recently sought treatment for PTSD from the Vietnam era. Unlike Bruce, Chris was only able to corroborate 41% of these cases by extracting corroborating indicators from the DD-201 file. So the obvious question is, well, gee, what would have happened had he consulted other sources? Would he, up the corroboration rate? Possibly to some degree, but probably not by too much. Here's why. A lot of the uncorroborated cases gave really strange stories that were quite inconsistent with what was in the file. So you'd get things like, a cook claiming to have been in the Hanoi Hilton, or a clerk claiming to have been traumatized in the secret Green Beret mission, which were clearly inconsistent with what was in the record. In fact, he found out that the uncorroborated cases reported involvement in battlefield atrocities at twice the rate as the corroborated ones. But in any event, The third thing that Bruce did was use the Global Assessment of Functioning Scale, the GAF scale, rating as a proxy for DSM-4 criterion F, the impairment criterion. As you know, the DSM-3R, which was the system in effect during the NVVRS survey, did not require that symptoms actually be impairing for a diagnosis to be assigned in the case of PTSD. And it's been this impairment thing that has caught the attention of the historians of military psychiatry, such as Ben Shepard, for example. Ben said, the real problem with the MVVRS is that its equation of symptoms with genuine psychopathology winds up producing numbers which in any other context are patently absurd. That is, not all emotional changes wrought by serving in a war zone are symptoms of disease or disorder. What these guys are arguing is that we really need to discriminate between normal distress responses that occur to anybody who's serving in such a stressful situation versus impairing symptoms of disorder. Important distinction that we didn't have in DSM-3R. They suspect that might have something to do with the MVVRS rates. Well, anyway, this is what Bruce found. His lifetime prevalence rate drops down to 18.7. Current prevalence rate drops to 9.1%. In other words, his reanalysis indicates that the original MVVRS research team overestimated the prevalence of PTSD by 40%. But even Dohrenwend's use of the GAF may still have resulted in an overestimate of PTSD if one requires clinically significant impairment to assign the diagnosis. Here's why. The Global Assessment of Functioning Scale ranges from 1 through 9. 1 is the worst level of functioning, 9 is the highest level of functioning. Bruce called the cases impaired, accepted the cases PTSD positive if the person got a 1 through 7. But what does a 7 look like? This is what it is. Quote, some difficulty in social, occupational, or school functioning, but generally functioning pretty well. Has some meaningful interpersonal relationships or some mild symptoms, depressed mood, mild insomnia, occasional truancy or theft around the house. Functioning pretty well. Mild insomnia. A 7 rating does not sound like impairment warranting clinical intervention. So what happens if we just knock it down a notch to 6? Moderate difficulty in social, occupational, or school functioning, or moderate symptoms. Few friends and conflicts with peers, flat affect and circumstantial speech, occasional panic attacks. Incidentally, you have to go down to a 5 before inability to hold a job comes into play. So what would happen if Bruce had defined impairment as 1 through 6 rather than 1 through 7? Well, here's current prevalence, for example. 15.2 in the original, 9.1 is what Bruce did. It drops to 5.4%. That is, if one requires clinical impairment, then the NVVRS overestimated the rate of PTSD by approximately 65%. But still, a current prevalence of 5.4% is more than twice as great as the 2.2 found by the CDC's Vietnam Experience study, a study whose methods almost certainly underestimated the rate of PTSD. Now, in conclusion, in his recent essay in Stress Points called Our Common Bonds, Dean Kilpatrick reminded us to not forget our common bonds. That is, our concern with the welfare of trauma patients, a thing that sort of binds us together, the beneficiaries of our clinical and research work. Dean also bemoaned the frequent bickering that occurs in our field, and he emphasized the importance of doing scientific research and rigorous critique and so forth. But he contradicted himself, I think, in his take-home message, in which he said, in my view, our field would do well to focus more on our common bonds and less on our differences. But if we downplay our differences, muffle our dissent, curb our critique, pick your paraphrase, studies like Bruce's might never be done. Why? Because it's our differences that make the difference. Our differences are what inspire the science that advances our field and ultimately helps the victims of trauma. Thank you for your attention.